Serious, what is a victimless crime? Salem Scout said. Feeding parking meters. Illegal where I live, which is dumb, because the funds from parking meters go to the mayor's commission to end homelessness. Not only am I preventing someone from getting a ticket, I'm also helping the homeless population. A Play Part 5 said. There's this artist named Benji Hughes. He released 3 albums at once but they disappeared. I looked everywhere. I contacted him and the label, trying to find them so I could buy them. Eventually I found one single person that had them. Finally got them. Then he ended up releasing them on YouTube and Spotify like a month or 2 later. I would strongly suggest listening to him if you like lyrics and good melodies. He's a songwriter for a lot of commercials and movies. His own material is amazing. Try listening to A Love Extreme by him. Crazy album with all kinds of styles. Most people I show him to end up liking him a lot. Category Kiwi said. It depends on how it's handled. Emulation itself is legal, but it is often done in illegal ways. Most notable, other than the games, is the BIOS, firmware stuff, basically the programming for the brains of a PlayStation. It is illegal to copy and distribute that, but it's something emulators need to run. This is why PlayStation emulators, for example, don't give you the BIOS file despite it being necessary to actually play PlayStation games, why you're forced to go to other sites to download one. That way the emulator's creators aren't breaking any rules, and thus don't get their sites shut down or other legal ramifications. However, making a BIOS copy from a PlayStation that you actually physically own is completely legal, as is the rest of the emulation programs. So if you pull the BIOS from your own PlayStation and run the BIOS using an original disc of the game you want to play, you're doing everything completely legally. It's the piracy that's illegal, the distribution of pirated games in BIOS. Nia Astic said. Sony 2. I want to know whose dumb idea was it at Sony HQ, to not re-release the digital classics that are still left behind in the PS3 era. Need I make the mention that they're digital releases that otherwise don't require physical parts to run them, except needing the software and some hardware to properly emulate them? For fucking shame, Sony. And no, the mini console you released a couple years back wasn't suitable enough. You left out classics and that shit, just like you left out classics that could have been re-released digitally but you didn't want to lift a finger and make business to make them available. So fuck you too. That's coming from a Sony faithful. Hurricane32 said. As others have said, emulating games you own, by ripping or dumping your own copies, and using BIOS files extracted from the console you own is perfectly legal. One thing I personally consider to also be ethically okay, is downloading games that never got re-released on modern platforms, especially rare games. For example, there is a game called Panzer Dragoon Saga, on the Sega Saturn. That game, considered to be one of the best ever made, suffered from poor sales at launch, which makes it rare. To add to that, allegedly the source code is lost, meaning it's impossible to re-release that game on modern platforms. The only way to get a copy of that game physically today is to buy it second-hand for upwards of $500 on eBay, and besides, even if you do decide to pay that ridiculous amount, the money doesn't even go to the developers. I know it's kind of a gray area, but it's just my opinion. Hurricane32 said. As others have said, emulating games you own, by ripping or dumping your own copies, and using BIOS files extracted from the console you own is perfectly legal. One thing I personally consider to also be ethically okay, is downloading games that never got re-released on modern platforms, especially rare games. For example, there is a game called Panzer Dragoon Saga, on the Sega Saturn. That game, considered to be one of the best ever made, suffered from poor sales at launch, which makes it rare. To add to that, allegedly the source code is lost, meaning it's impossible to re-release that game on modern platforms. The only way to get a copy of that game physically today is to buy it second-hand for upwards of $500 on eBay, and besides, even if you do decide to pay that ridiculous amount, the money doesn't even go to the developers. I know it's kind of a gray area, but it's just my opinion. Phoenix Matrix said. Laws generally have context that gets lost with time. Let's say you make that law, owners aren't responsible for what happens in the trash. Now some business is getting annoyed at homeless people being around and accidentally poisons the food, in a way that could have happened normally, Egg mold. Oops. No liability, poor homeless people, so sad. Then all of a sudden people will be posting in a thread like this going, OMG, I can't believe they're not liable for this. Who thought it was a good idea? Urban Lulu said. Same with makeup companies like Ulta, for example. People dumpster dive for makeup that's tossed all the time, and it's incredibly dangerous because you have no idea why these products were tossed in the first place. Most products are usually tossed because of sanitary reasons, recalls, chemicals, burns, or infections people got from the product, or someone with an eye infection used it and contaminated it. Many reasons into why brand new looking products get tossed. Now a lot of companies are now instructed to heavily destroy anything they toss so people won't dumpster dive for it. It really is a huge liability thing. Chilpapafrida said. This is the reason on paper, but it's not 100% true. With bakery items, they're not always expired, more like not as fresh. I used to work in a bakery and we would throw out all the bread items that were made that day. One of my coworkers got caught diving to feed homeless people. Our university has a very high homeless population, and was promptly fired. There's no difference between if someone bought a muffin seconds before close or if they found it 8 minutes after I threw it out the door. This is something that made me rage. Chilpapafrida said. This is the reason on paper, but it's not 100% true. With bakery items, they're not always expired, more like not as fresh. I used to work in a bakery and we would throw out all the bread items that were made that day. One of my coworkers got caught diving to feed homeless people. Our university has a very high homeless population, and was promptly fired. There's no difference between if someone bought a muffin seconds before close or if they found it 8 minutes after I threw it out the door. This is something that made me rage. 1234 Tempcore said. I do this all the time. Some of the large manufacturing facilities near us have scrap bins where they toss metal, broken parts, tools, equipment, etc. No garbage. They pay for it to be removed by weight or volume depending on the contract. I hop in those dumpsters and pull out expensive metal scrap, hardware, fittings, used drill bits, etc. I have a stack of aluminum in our shed probably worth $8,000 that I pulled out of a dumpster. I know some of the managers at those facilities and their exact words were, "You're saving us money, but if you get hurt in the process it's on you." Blind Bison said. Example of this. I purchased Far Cry 5 digitally only to be astounded by how terribly it performed and it micro-stuttered constantly. After some research I found out Ubisoft's DRM is just awful, so I acquired a cracked copy that worked perfectly, no more stuttering because they bypassed the DRM layers. That type of crap that punishes paying customers is absurd. For people who don't believe me, look into Overlord Gaming's DRM tests or check out Digital Foundry or Modern Vintage Gamer's tests of the abysmal Revillage DRM, which causes stuttering. Since it blew up though, at least Capcom patched the DRM in their game, but crappy DRM implementations which harm performance and or cause stuttering do happen. Farnsworth's son said. The issue is a driver is not expecting anyone to be crossing since there are no parking lots, building entrances, etc. along the road and may be less alert. That's somewhat circular reasoning. If jaywalking weren't an offense, a driver wouldn't have an excuse not to expect pedestrians anywhere and everywhere. Plus, frankly, pedestrians aren't remotely the only possible hazard on the road. If a driver's not paying full attention, they shouldn't be behind the wheel. Okay, so here's a non-American perspective. The historical fact is that jaywalking is basically an offense invented by the early US motor industry. Look it up, by all means. It had an image problem over the number of accidents involving pedestrians, and in true American commercial fashion embarked on an advertising campaign to vindicate the industry and shift the blame, first in perception and then in law, onto the victims, basically for daring to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And the law has been broadly fossilized in that state ever since. Farnsworth's son said. Meanwhile, the rest of the world has mostly managed fine without similar laws. And, yes, I know there are exceptions, and some places where you take your life in your hands trying to cross the road. But that's not because of the absence of a jaywalking law per se. In the UK here, for example, we have no such laws, yet the rate of pedestrian deaths is roughly half that of the US. We do, however, have significantly more stringent driving tests, and very broad brush offenses for drivers such as driving without due care and attention and dangerous driving. Broad brush in this case is good. Case law means that the courts know what the offenses look like, and wriggling out on a technicality is hard when a law simply isn't framed in a manner that creates nooks and crannies to hide in. Basically, if you're driving a vehicle here, the legal burden is firmly on you to stay focused at all times and make sure that everyone else remains safe. You're not allowed to defocus and relax just because, say, you don't think you're likely to meet a pedestrian on your current stretch of road. Vanilla Acid said, the jaywalking law and its consequences, or lack thereof, circles back to the broader law that is in North America, but not everywhere else, that the pedestrian has the right of way. In USA and Canada, probably others, these are just what I know, the pedestrian has the right of way at legal crosswalks, and all vehicles need to stop for them at any time. This leads to people thinking that it also applies in other circumstances, so people crossing wherever expect vehicles to stop for them, and are people in the vehicles stopping when they aren't supposed to in order to let pedestrians across, common in smaller cities. Most of the countries that don't have the same problems regarding pedestrian crossings are because in those countries, the vehicle has the right of way, and the pedestrian must wait until it's clear safe to cross. This leads to a difference in culture, and changes the subconscious of how people approach the situation to begin with. Hostile Carrot said, in Wrightsville Beach, North Carolina, it is illegal to ride a bicycle without using both hands to steer. So, I'm a criminal defense attorney and I am going to share a sort of multi-year mental philosophical battle I had relevant to this topic. When I was in high school, I took a criminal justice elective course. One day, during class, we discussed the topic of victimless crimes. Crime, obviously, is something that is against the law. However, it is generally understood that a crime is an act harmful not only to some individual but also to a community, society, or the state. So, by its very nature, there should not be such thing as victimless crime, because crime necessarily requires a victim. So, of course, we bring up that drug use, marijuana as a primary example, does not create a victim. My teacher's argument was that there are numerous victims of drug use, the user who may accomplish less than they would but for the substance use, children of the user who may receive inadequate care because of the use, or simply the parent having less money, friends and family of the user who may receive less attention or whatever from the user, etc. Hostile Carrot said, for a number of years I generally accepted that as a valid point, there is victims of drug use. For whatever reason, this stuck in my mind for a long time, and when I was in law school I was researching something of a similar nature when it finally fucking occurred to me, crime requires a victim. So, while a drug user may not properly provide care for their child, the drug use isn't a crime. The crime is child abuse, and the drug use is an aggravating factor. Which brings me back to the no riding a bicycle with no hands thing. Riding a bicycle with no hands does not necessarily create a victim, so it is not a crime. I mean, it's illegal, but that is bullshit for anyone who understands what crime is, philosophically. Failing to heed to traffic is a crime because negligence caused an accident that would not have otherwise occurred, creating victims. If you failed to heed because you were riding a bicycle with no hands, that is an aggravating factor, but the no hands thing is not a crime. It is an attempt to prevent other crime by prohibiting victimless behavior. Lamprophonia said, the user who may accomplish less than they would but for the substance use, children of the user who may receive inadequate care because of the use, or simply the parent having less money, friends and family of the user who may receive less attention or whatever from the user, etc. This isn't an actual argument. Neglecting a child is the event, not why they did it. All of these things can be applied to video games. If I spend money on video games, I have less to spend on my kid. Does that mean that my hobby is a crime and my son the victim? Of course not. Criminal neglect is a crime. Playing video games isn't. Even if I was neglecting my child for the sake of a video game. These are actual lawyers saying this shit? Crazed Waffle Party said, it's a preventative law. Studies done in Germany found that legalized prostitution leads to more sex trafficking. Legalization increases demand for sexual services, and sex traffickers, eager to meet this demand, coerce their victims to work through legal outlets. Demand would have to be controlled in such a way that law enforcement could keep up with the new demand and shady brothel owners couldn't use plausible deniability to hire coerced prostitutes. Safe, legalized prostitution is possible to ensure. Nevada has done a good job at it, but it's also expensive. Unless some political force galvanizes around the issue, no politician will champion the issue, as they'd have to sacrifice the support of puritanical voters. DC4 MVP said, "As a city worker, please don't do this. If you're going to do a temporary fix, it may get overlooked as completed. If we still have it on our list, yes, it's ungodly long here in Minnesota as we have a full crew doing it 8 hours a day all summer, then instead of just showing up to fill it, takes a few minutes, we have to undo what you did, which can be as simple as scooping out class 5 or having to break and dig out whatever cheap, crappy asphalt you bought from Home Depot then get to filling it. So instead of taking 5-6 minutes to do the hole, now it's taking 20-25 minutes, and that means we get to less holes. Then there's liability. We have safety signs, lights, PPE, etc. to protect us when we're in the streets. You don't. You have a shovel and a vest, maybe. Also, it may be something more pressing than a pothole. Could be a sinkhole, could have exposed utilities, could have exposed the sewer system, etc. All things that need more attention than some hot mix. It sucks, but leave it alone. We don't come into your job if something we need is taking a while to get done. We have 119 miles of road to cover and only 18 workers with 5 dedicated to potholes patching those 119 miles of city road." Amori 412 said, "Theft from stores? Stealing stuff from a megacorp, don't care about, but stealing from a mom-pop bodega 100% has a victim. Those people have to buy their stock and make a living. I worked in a megacorp with a buddy on evenings at college. One day girl is visibly upset. She is decidedly looking at money and the baby food in her basket and calculating costs and putting stuff back. My buddy and I ask if she needs any assistance. She is holding tears back, shaking her head, and my buddy tells her to pick up the food and he'll ring her up. She's standing there like, I can't afford it, I have 14 here and like 8 left on my card. He rang it up, refunded it immediately, handing her the bag and the receipt. These megacorps throw perfectly good tins away with dense or close to best before dates, so they can afford to lose 20 for a struggling mother. She came back a few weeks later. She looked happier, walked past us and whispered thank you." Goat Eating Troll said, "Victimless, or no victim according to the law. Because California has Prop 65, which made it possible to sue businesses for failing to warn of cancer-causing hazards even if no damage occurred. The concept was to hold businesses responsible for warning people of the hazards to avoid the penalty even if there was no victim. But what it really caused was a huge influx of civil suits where lawyers, or their agents, would just walk around and file a lawsuit against any business or building that didn't have a Prop 65 warning posted." TheLive4Real said, "How technical do you want to get? Simplified, it's a crime where only the perp or the perp and a willing consenting person are involved. In most cases, it's a male prohibit crime. Illegal only because someone decided it should be. Personal drug use, prostitution, sexual behavior, such as homosexuality, possession of contraband, or assisted suicide. Suicide was one that could be punished, which always confused me. The problem is, does it exist? A man who goes to a prostitute, has sex, and then takes an STD home to his wife is a good example. Some argue the wife is the victim and demand prostitution be illegal. But, what stops him from finding a willing woman, free of charge, who could infect him just as easily? Prostitution is enforced but adultery and fornication are not. Homosexuality is another. For ages, 2 gay men were condemned for sex. Some claimed this was immoral and spread homosexuality and disease. Some even claimed it was a sin against God. Yet, a man and woman can do the same things and it was fine. Anal and oral sex were accepted, even if forbidden by some religions." TheLive4Real said, "A big one today is recreational drug use. Here, you have 2 serious groups. One claims that it is wrong and harms society. The use of it is a burden on the healthcare system too. The other claims it is a right and points out it was legal before the 1970s. Several of the illegal drugs are former medicines or natural herbs that have been used to treat diseases. They are rarely inflicted on others intentionally, though they have been. Where it gets messy is with child porn, bestiality, incest, and so on. Legally, we say that children are too young to give consent or be willing participants. And this is normally true. However, you have teenagers who willingly send nude photos to others and have children from sexual relations. Bestiality should be a no-brainer, but some say animals have no rights. Incest is mixed. Some argue that it should be legal with consent, such as between adults. Now, in fairness, most of these who argue these things are rarely neutral. NAMBLA, for instance, has a vested interest in seeing children and adults sexually active. I believe they cite the Greeks here, but I could be wrong. Those involved in bestiality tend to be for it legally, as are those involved in incestual relationships. In other words, they have a vested interest in seeing their side win. The other side has its reasons too, such as religious or morality. Running Dreams said, I feel most crimes have a victim, direct or indirect. But we as a society have to draw some lines, somewhere. For example, some say that using party drugs are a victimless crime. But I don't know, if something goes haywire, it hurts families and communities. Same goes for a lot of things though. Laws are tough. Edit, for sake of interesting discussion, let me know what crime you think is truly victimless and let's discuss it. I actually lean generally towards there being fewer laws, even though I simultaneously believe almost all crimes have victims of some sort. But again, confusing and broad topic indeed. Even jaywalking could cause a car to veer and crash, could cause a little kid to witness it and be inspired to do the same, could do a lot of things indirectly. Dishonorably Count said. Not to mention, abandoned is subjective to an extent. The insane asylum that's been closed since 1970 is different from a warehouse that's been closed since the 2009 recession. One might have nothing useful to the owners and can get trashed and graffitied relatively victimlessly. On the other hand, a place might be waiting for funds to reopen, or have valuable products in storage. The other thing is housing. In Baltimore, near where I am, there are lots of abandoned row homes. Sometimes entire blocks. The city is paying to demolish certain homes and blocks at the request of remaining residents. These aren't NIMBYs, these are low-income residents that have been there decades, but want vacant houses demolished because they turn into havens for squatters, addicts, or worse. In a sense, it's bad to see them torn down, but trespassing might keep residents a block away from improving their community. Maya Mega said. Voluntary prostitution. Unless the prostitute steals and doesn't tell, it doesn't have a victim. And before we get in technicalities, I say voluntary is not against their will. After all, human trafficking and rape have victims and very damaged so. But if the person is like so, you put your dong in my butt and then a 50 in my hand and the other is like okay, then it's more like mutual benefits. In another note, necrophilia. It's disturbing, messed up, disgusting, and compulsory psych ward stays should go to anyone who have it. But a corpse won't carry any consequences from being raped. Unless, of course, you count the impact on the family if they find out. Maya Mega said. Voluntary prostitution. Unless the prostitute steals and doesn't tell, it doesn't have a victim. And before we get in technicalities, I say voluntary is not against their will. After all, human trafficking and rape have victims and very damaged so. But if the person is like so, you put your dong in my butt and then a 50 in my hand and the other is like okay, then it's more like mutual benefits. In another note, necrophilia. It's disturbing, messed up, disgusting, and compulsory psych ward stays should go to anyone who have it. But a corpse won't carry any consequences from being raped. Unless, of course, you count the impact on the family if they find out. McKelnitz said. The act of doing coke is a fairly victimless crime. However, buying it is definitely not. The path that coke takes from South America to get to your country is lined with the bodies of innocent people. Basically, when you buy that 8-ball, some of that money will go to pay salaries to dudes whose job is to cut people's heads off, torture, and kidnap. But you know, the victims are just poor people who live in foreign countries. What do they matter compared to 15 minutes of feeling a little more confident about yourself? Merlion Otter Bear Clown said. In some situations, speeding. Obviously there are plenty of situations where speeding is a reckless and shitty thing to do. But in my state the top speed limit is 55 miles per hour. Exceeding the limit by 30+ mph can be a felony. My state is in the Midwest. A lot of the roads are super straight and super flat. I can 100% safely go 85-90 mph on them when no one is around. Pisses me off that I could get a felony for going 90. Ends up costing me on long trips.